and a future that felt secure and predictable. But what mattered most to me was the person I chose to share that future with, my husband. We met through mutual friends, and from the beginning, everything about him felt right. When I was stressed, he comforted me. When I was unsure, he reassured me. It didn't take long before I started to rely on him emotionally. What began as simple conversations slowly turned into something deeper, something I believed was genuine trust. As our relationship progressed, there were no major conflicts. No. In fact, everything seemed unusually smooth. He was consistent in his behavior, always present, always supportive. My family liked him, and my close friends approved of him without hesitation. That only strengthened my confidence in the decision I was making. When he proposed, I didn't feel doubt. It felt natural, like the next step in a life that was already moving in the right direction. I said yes, believing that I had found someone who would stand by me through everything. Our wedding was a simple celebration filled with familiar faces. He looked at me during the ceremony the same way he always had, calm, reassuring, and deeply present. At that moment, I felt safe, certain that I was entering a partnership built on trust. After the wedding, we began planning our honeymoon. Distractions. I remember thinking that this trip would be the beginning of something even stronger between us. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. Even during those early moments, there was a subtle shift I couldn't fully explain. A feeling I tried to ignore. Something small, something quiet, but enough to make me pause. How we met still feels simple when I think about it. It wasn't something dramatic or unexpected. We were introduced through mutual friends at a small gathering. At first, it was just casual conversation, nothing that suggested anything serious would come out of it. But he paid attention in a way most people don't. He remembered small details I mentioned, asked thoughtful questions, and made me feel heard without trying too hard. Over the following weeks, we stayed in contact. What started as occasional messages slowly became daily conversations. We talked about everything: our goals, our families, our past experiences, and even our fears. There was a natural flow between us that made it easy to open up. I didn't feel judged when I spoke, and he seemed equally comfortable sharing his. That mutual openness created a strong emotional connection much faster than I expected. As our conversations deepened, so did my attachment. So I began to look forward to hearing from him, to sharing parts of my day, and to knowing that someone was consistently there. It wasn't overwhelming or rushed, it felt steady, like something building on its own. There were no arguments, no misunderstandings that lasted long, and no moments that made me question his intentions. Everything felt stable when he started. Meeting my family, the reaction was just as reassuring. They found him respectful and well. He spoke politely, listened carefully, and presented himself as someone responsible and dependable. My friends also accepted him without hesitation. No one raised concerns, and no one saw anything unusual. Their approval made it easier for me. I trusted his words, his actions, and his consistency. He never gave me a reason to doubt him, and that absence of doubt strengthened my confidence in him even more. I trusted him completely. That trust wasn't built overnight. It grew naturally through repeated reassurance, calm behavior, and a sense of emotional safety I had never experienced before. But looking back, there were moments I didn't fully notice at the time, subtle shifts that didn't seem important then, and slowly something in his behavior began to change as the days passed. The distance between us didn't just remain, it grew stronger. What started as small changes in his behavior turned into a consistent pattern that I could no longer ignore. Our communication became minimal. Conversations that once flowed naturally now felt forced, one-sided, or incomplete. I would speak, ask questions, or try to engage him, but his responses were often delayed, short, or absent altogether. He stopped initiating conversations. Even simple interactions, the kind that usually happen without thinking, began to disappear. Meals were quiet, walks were silent. Moments that should have felt shared started to feel isolated, as if we were two people moving through the same space without truly being connected. Eye contact became another noticeable change. Earlier, he used to look at me directly when we spoke, but now he often avoided my gaze. When our eyes did meet, the connection felt brief and distant, like he was quickly looking away to avoid something. That avoidance made me feel uncomfortable. Even though I couldn't fully understand why, I tried to adjust my own behavior, hoping that maybe I was overthinking things. I continued to talk normally, to act the way I always had, trying to maintain the connection we once shared, but his responses remained unchanged. The warmth that once defined our interactions seemed to be fading with each passing day. I felt like a stranger to him. That realization was difficult to accept. The person who once knew me so well, who paid attention to my thoughts and feelings, now seemed disconnected from me in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't conflict or disagreement, it was absence, emotional absence. This growing discomfort began to affect me internally. I found myself questioning simple things, whether I should speak, whether I should wait, whether something was wrong with me instead. The silence between us became heavier than words, filling the space with uncertainty. And then came a moment that felt different from all the others. A moment where nothing was said, nothing was done, but everything changed. In that silent moment, something shifted that I couldn't ignore anymore. The more I experienced his distance, the more my mind began to turn inward. At first, I blamed the situation on external factors. I told myself he was simply going through something personal, something he hadn't found the words to express yet. But as the silence continued, that explanation started to feel less convincing. Began questioning myself instead. I replayed our conversations in my head, wondering if I had said something wrong or acted in a way that pushed him away. Every small interaction became something I analyzed afterward. Did I sound too demanding? Did I misinterpret his tone? Was I expecting too much? These questions started repeating in my mind, slowly building a sense of self-doubt I wasn't used to feeling. Even when there were clear signs that something had changed in him, I found myself downplaying them. The reduced communication, the lack of eye contact, the emotional distance. I acknowledged them, but I didn't fully confront what they might mean. Instead, I chose to rationalize them. I convinced myself that relationships naturally go through phases, and that this was just one of them. There were moments when I felt a small hesitation inside me. I didn't want to create tension or assume the worst without clear evidence. Hoping things would resolve on their own, I started questioning everything. Not just him, but myself, my perception, and even my judgment. That uncertainty made it harder to trust what I was feeling. The more I tried to find logical explanations, the more conflicted I became internally. It was as if I was standing between what I sensed and what I wanted to believe, unable to fully commit to either side at the same time. A quiet discomfort began to settle in the background of my thoughts. It wasn't loud or immediate, but it was persistent. A feeling that something was not aligned, even if I couldn't define exactly what it was. And deep down, a subtle warning began to form, one I didn't fully understand yet, but couldn't completely ignore either. As our honeymoon continued, the inconsistencies in his behavior became harder to overlook. There were moments when he seemed almost like his old self, again calm, attentive, and briefly engaged in conversation. In those moments, I would feel a sense of relief, convincing myself that whatever distance had appeared earlier was temporary. But those moments didn't last. They would be followed by periods of silence, detachment, or complete disinterest. The shift between these two behaviors created confusion that I struggled to understand. One moment he would respond normally, and the next, he would withdraw again. Without explanation, there was no clear pattern, no reason I could identify. Just unpredictable changes that kept me uncertain. This inconsistency made it difficult to approach him. Every time I considered asking what was wrong, I hesitated. I didn't know which version of him I would be speaking to, the one who would respond calmly, or the one who would avoid the conversation entirely. That uncertainty slowly made me more reserved in my own behavior as well. I started adjusting myself, trying to match his mood, hoping that if I remained calm and patient, things would stabilize again. But instead of improving the situation, it only increased the confusion. The emotional connection that once felt strong now felt unstable, like something that could shift without warning. Something didn't feel right anymore. It wasn't just a feeling, it was becoming a constant presence in my thoughts. I couldn't fully relax, even in moments that seemed normal. There was always a slight tension underneath the surface, a quiet awareness that something had changed and was continuing to change without my understanding. Despite this, I still chose to believe that things could return to normal. I avoided confrontation and continued moving forward with the trip, hoping that time and shared experiences would naturally bring us back to how we used to be. That's when he suggested we go somewhere different. Somewhere higher, away from the main area, where the views were more open and isolated, and without realizing it, I agreed to go into the mountains with him. When he suggested going into the mountains, I didn't immediately feel concerned. In fact, his tone at that moment sounded normal, calm, composed, and similar to how he used to speak before the distance between us began. He explained it as a place with a better view, a quieter environment, and an opportunity to experience something memorable during our honeymoon. We discussed the idea briefly, and since it seemed like a reasonable plan, I agreed without hesitation. There was nothing in his voice or behavior that raised immediate alarm. For a moment, it felt like things were returning to a familiar rhythm again. His communication became slightly more engaging during the planning, which gave me a sense of reassurance that the earlier tension might have been temporary. We prepared for the trip together in a simple and practical way. There was no unusual urgency or secrecy in how it was arranged. It felt like any other activity we had planned during the honeymoon, straightforward and normal. I didn't question the decision further because I still trusted him. Despite the changes I had noticed, that trust hadn't completely disappeared. It was still there, quietly influencing my judgment. As we got ready to leave, he maintained the same composed demeanor. There was no sign of conflict, no indication that anything was wrong. That consistency in his tone made it easier for me to relax and stop overanalyzing his behavior, at least temporarily. I told myself that perhaps I had been overthinking the situation, and that this trip might help us reconnect in some way. I had no idea what was coming at that point. Everything seemed ordinary. There were no visible warnings, no obvious signs that anything unusual would happen. The decision to go felt like just another part of the honeymoon experience, something meant to be enjoyed together. We left the main area and began moving toward the mountains, gradually leaving behind the familiar surrounding. The environment started to change as we traveled further, becoming quieter and more isolated. And as we reached the destination, I had no idea that this place would become the turning point of everything that was about to happen. As we continued our journey toward the mountains, the surroundings began to shift. The path became steeper, the air felt different, and the further we moved away from the main area, the quieter everything seemed. There were fewer people, fewer signs of activity, and more open space around us. The change in environment didn't seem unusual at first, but it slowly added to the growing sense of isolation. What stood out more than anything was his silence. From the moment we started moving upward, he barely spoke. There were no questions, no casual comments, no attempts at conversation. At first, I thought he might simply be focused on the path or concentrating on the climb. But as time passed, his silence remained unchanged. I tried to speak a few times, asking simple questions or making light comments, hoping to create some interaction between us. His responses, however, were minimal. Sometimes he would nod, sometimes give a short reply, and other times not respond at all. The lack of engagement made the journey feel longer and more disconnected than expected. I began to feel a subtle unease growing inside me. It wasn't something dramatic or sudden, but a quiet discomfort that became more noticeable the longer we stayed in that state of limited communication. The silence between us felt heavier than before, almost as if it carried meaning that I couldn't fully understand. His silence felt heavier than words. It wasn't just the absence of conversation, it was the absence of connection. Walking beside him without meaningful interaction made me feel increasingly uncertain. I started observing his behavior more closely, trying to find any sign that could explain his mood, but there was nothing clear to interpret. Despite that, I continued moving forward with him, step by step, as the terrain became more elevated and open. The path eventually led us toward a wider area where the surroundings seemed to drop away on one side, and that's when we reached the cliff area. The atmosphere around us felt different from everything that had come before. The openness of the space and the drop beyond it naturally drew attention. But what caught mine most was his behavior at that moment. He stopped walking and remained still for a few seconds, looking ahead. I noticed that he wasn't speaking, and when I turned to look at him, his expression seemed to change. It wasn't the same calm or neutral look I had grown used to during the trip. There was something in his gaze that felt unfamiliar, something that didn't align with the way he had been acting earlier at first. I tried to read his expression as just another moment of quietness, but the way he was looking at me made me pause. His eyes were fixed on me, but not in a warm or familiar way. It felt direct, almost intense, as if he was observing me differently than before. That shift made me slightly uncomfortable. Though I couldn't immediately explain why, I looked away briefly, then back again, trying to confirm whether it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. His focus remained on me, and the silence between us seemed to stretch longer than usual, more concentrated. His eyes didn't look the same. There was no warmth in them like before, no softness that I used to associate with his presence. Instead, there was a distant, unreadable quality that made it difficult to feel at ease. I stood there, unsure of how to respond to the moment, trying to understand what had changed in such a short span of time. For a brief moment, everything felt still, but something about it made me hesitate before taking a step. At that moment, the conversation between us was almost non-existent. After he called me closer, there wasn't any further explanation or casual dialogue. It wasn't the kind of interaction I was used to. Normally, even in quiet moments, there would be some exchange, something small to maintain a sense of connection. Trying to understand his intention. His tone had been calm, but it didn't carry the same familiarity I once trusted. There was a stillness in his presence that felt different from the earlier parts of our trip. It wasn't loud or aggressive, it was subtle but noticeable enough to make me hesitate internally. As I looked at him, I found myself caught between two opposing thoughts. On one side, there was the trust I had built over time, the belief that he was my husband, the person I had chosen to rely on. That trust encouraged me to respond naturally, to follow his request without overthinking. On the other side, however, there was an internal feeling that I couldn't fully ignore. It wasn't based on logic or evidence, but it was persistent. A quiet discomfort that seemed to grow stronger in that exact moment. I couldn't clearly define what triggered it, but it made me more aware of my surroundings and his behavior. Tension between trust and instinct became harder to manage. I questioned whether I was overreacting or simply being cautious. Each second that passed added more weight to that internal conflict. Standing still in front of him, I felt the pressure of making a simple decision that suddenly didn't feel simple at all. Something inside me warned me. It wasn't a clear voice or a definite thought, but more like an instinctive hesitation that urged me to slow down. Despite that, I didn't fully step back or walk away. Instead, I tried to maintain composure, telling myself that there was no reason to assume anything negative. I took a small step forward, and that single step brought me closer to him than I realized. Closer to a moment that would change everything in an instant. In that moment, everything changed. There was no warning, no further conversation, no indication that anything was about to happen. 1 second, I was standing in front of him, trying to process the tension between us, and the next second, everything shifted in a way I never expected. I remember his hand moving suddenly. It wasn't slow or hesitant, it was immediate, decisive. Before I could react or step back, I felt a strong force against my body. It came without hesitation, breaking through any remaining sense of stability I had in that moment. The impact of that push caught me completely off guard. My balance broke instantly. The ground beneath me no longer felt secure. It all happened so quickly that my mind struggled. There was no shock, no regret, no hesitation. And the sense of stability, the space behind me opened up into emptiness. And before I could even attempt to react properly, I was no longer standing, I was falling. In that moment, everything changed. The realization came too late. What I had believed, trusted, and relied on had been shattered in an instant. There was no time to process emotions, no time to ask questions, no time to make sense of his actions. All that remained was the sudden transition from standing on solid ground to losing it entirely. And as my body left the edge, I began falling into the unknown, with nothing to stop it, and no way to turn back. As soon as I lost contact with the ground, the feeling of control disappeared completely. There was nothing beneath me, nothing to steady my body, nothing to hold on to. My mind struggled to process what was happening in those first few seconds. As my body continued moving downward without resistance, the initial shock was overwhelming. My arms moved instinctively, reaching out for something, anything, but there was only empty space around me. Each movement felt disconnected, as if the sudden drop, the unexpected nature of the situation, and the realization that I had been pushed all combined into a single overwhelming moment. My breathing became uneven, and my awareness sharpened as I became fully conscious of what was happening. There was no confusion anymore, only the certainty that I was falling with no control over the outcome. In those moments, time felt distorted. Everything seemed both fast and slow at the same time. The ground below appeared distant, yet I could feel myself moving toward it with increasing speed. My thoughts became fragmented, moving between disbelief and a growing understanding of the reality I was facing. I realized I was going to die. That thought didn't come as a dramatic relief. It came quietly, but with clarity. It was the kind of realization that removes all uncertainty and replaces it with a single, unavoidable conclusion. I tried to brace myself, instinctively, but there was nothing I could do to prepare properly. My body continued to fall, rotating slightly as gravity pulled me downward. The wind rushed past me, adding to the intensity of the moment, while my senses remained fully alert to every second passing. And as the ground rapidly approached, impact. The impact was sudden, violent, and overwhelming. There was no gradual transition, just a sharp, crushing collision that sent a wave of pain through my entire body at once. My body broke on impact. The force of the fall was absorbed in an instant, and I could feel the immediate consequences of it. My limbs reacted in ways I couldn't control, and the alignment of my body felt completely disrupted. The shock of the landing left me unable to process anything clearly for a brief moment. All I could feel was pain, intense, sharp, and spreading through multiple areas of my body. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond the way I expected. There was a disconnect between my mind and my physical ability. My legs didn't react properly, and any attempt to shift my position resulted in more discomfort. Even the smallest movement triggered a stronger sensation of pain, making it clear that something was seriously wrong. Breathing became difficult. Each inhale felt restricted, and every exhale carried a sense of strain. My chest felt tight, and the effort required just to breathe added to the overwhelming discomfort. I attempted to stabilize myself, but the lack of control over my body made it nearly impossible. At the same time, my mind was trying to catch up with what had just happened. The realization that I had been pushed, followed by the fall and the impact, created a mental shock that matched the physical one. It was difficult to fully process everything at once, and my thoughts felt scattered and unfocused. Despite the pain, I remained conscious enough to understand that my situation was critical. My body was not functioning normally, and I couldn't rely on my usual ability to move or respond. The combination of physical injury and mental shock left me in a vulnerable state where even basic actions felt out of reach. I lay there, unable to properly adjust my position, surrounded by silence. And the aftermath of the fall. Time felt uncertain, and my awareness began to fluctuate as the intensity of the situation continued to affect me. Slowly my vision started to blur, and my consciousness began to fade, pulling me deeper into darkness as the pain and shock took control. The moment my body hit the ground, everything changed instantly. The impact was sudden, violent, and overwhelming. There was no gradual transition, just a sharp, crushing collision that sent a wave of pain through my entire body at once. My body broke on impact. The force of the fall was absorbed in an instant, and I could feel the immediate consequences of it. My limbs reacted in ways I couldn't control, and the alignment of my body felt completely disrupted. The shock of the landing left me unable to process anything clearly for a brief moment. All I could feel was pain, intense, sharp, and spreading through multiple areas of my body. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond the way I expected. There was a disconnect between my mind and my physical ability. My legs didn't react properly, and any attempt to shift my position resulted in more discomfort. Even the smallest movement triggered a stronger sensation of pain, making it clear that something was seriously wrong. Breathing became difficult. Each inhale felt restricted, and every exhale carried a sense of strain. My chest felt tight, and the effort required just to breathe added to the overwhelming discomfort. I attempted to stabilize myself, but the lack of control over my body made it nearly impossible. At the same time, my mind was trying to catch up with what had just happened. The realization that I had been pushed, followed by the fall and the impact, created a mental shock that matched the physical one. It was difficult to fully process everything at once, and my thoughts felt scattered and unfocused. Despite the pain, I remained conscious enough to understand that my situation was critical. My body was not functioning normally, and I couldn't rely on my usual ability to move or respond. The combination of physical injury and mental shock left me in a vulnerable state where even basic actions felt out of reach. I lay there, unable to properly adjust my position, surrounded by silence and the aftermath of the fall. Time felt uncertain, and my awareness began to fluctuate as the intensity of the situation continued to affect me. Slowly, my vision started to blur, and my consciousness began to fade, pulling me deeper into darkness as the pain and shock took control. Lying there after the fall, every second felt heavier than the last. The pain hadn't settled, it continued to pulse through my body in waves, making even small movements feel impossible. I tried to stay as still as I could, not knowing whether moving would make things worse. My body felt weak, unresponsive, and unstable. I didn't know if I'd survive. That thought kept repeating in my mind as I struggled to stay conscious. My breathing was shallow and uneven, each inhale requiring effort that I wasn't sure I had the strength to maintain. The fear wasn't just about the pain, it was about the uncertainty of what would happen next. There was no one around, no immediate help, and no clear way to reach safety. Time felt distorted. I couldn't tell how long I had been lying there. Moments seemed to stretch, and each passing second felt longer than the one before it. My awareness would come and go slightly, but every time I regained focus, the reality of my situation remained unchanged. I was alone, injured, and unable to move properly. Mentally, I began to break down. Questions filled my mind, but there were no answers. Why did this happen? How could he do this? What would happen to me now? These thoughts didn't lead to clarity, they only added to the emotional weight I was already carrying. The shock of betrayal, combined with the physical condition I was in, created a sense of helplessness that was difficult to process. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, attempting to steady myself despite the pain. Holding on to even the smallest sense of control became important, because everything else fell out of reach. I didn't know what direction the situation would take, or if anyone would ever find me. Each passing moment felt uncertain, and the fear of what might come next lingered constantly in the background of my thoughts. And then, through the silence, I began to hear distant voices approaching. Faint at first, but real enough to give me a small sense of hope. The faint voices I heard slowly became clearer, cutting through the silence that had surrounded me. At first, I wasn't sure if I was imagining them or if they were real, but as they grew louder, I realized someone was actually nearby. Someone found me. I tried to respond, but my body didn't cooperate the way I wanted it to. My voice came out weak, barely audible. Even lifting my head felt difficult. Still, the presence of others gave me a small sense of relief. I could hear footsteps moving closer, followed by urgent voices communicating with each other. Soon, I felt hands gently reaching toward me, checking my condition. Their touch was careful and deliberate, as if they were trying not to cause further harm. I heard one of them say that I was badly injured and that immediate attention was needed. Their tone was serious, focused, and calm under pressure. Began assessing my situation quickly, speaking in short, clear instructions to each other. One of them stayed close to me, speaking softly, asking if I could hear them. I attempted to respond, but my strength was limited. My body remained weak, and any effort to move or speak required more energy than I could easily manage. Despite that, their presence made a difference. I was no longer alone. The sense of isolation that had been overwhelming just moments before started to ease slightly. Knowing that help had arrived gave me something to hold on to, even if only for a brief period. They carefully stabilized my position, ensuring that I remained as still as possible while they prepared for further assistance. Their movements were controlled and coordinated, indicating that they were experienced in handling emergency situations. As they continued working around me, my awareness began to fluctuate again. The combination of pain, exhaustion, and the severity of my injuries made it harder to stay fully conscious. My vision started to blur, and sounds became less distinct, as if they were fading into the background. Slowly, despite their efforts and presence, my consciousness began to slip away once more, and everything around me started to fade into darkness again. When I opened my eyes again, everything felt unfamiliar. The surroundings were no longer the open space where I had fallen. Instead, I was inside a confined shelter with dim lighting and simple wooden walls. The air felt still, and the environment was quiet, broken only by faint movements nearby. Was alive, barely. My body felt heavy and restricted. I tried to move, but even the smallest attempt sent sharp signals of pain through me. Bandages were wrapped around parts of my body, and supports had been placed to keep certain areas stable. My legs felt particularly weak, and any effort to shift them caused discomfort that I couldn't ignore. For a moment, I stayed still, trying to gather my thoughts. My memory was fragmented at first, but the events gradually returned the trip. The silence, the moment at the cliff, the push, and the fall. As the realization settled in, I became more aware of my current condition and the fact that I had survived the fall. A man sat nearby, noticing that I had regained consciousness. He spoke in a calm and steady tone, asking if I could hear him. His presence felt reassuring, and I tried to focus on his words. He explained that I had been found by climbers and brought to a safer place for immediate care. He continued by describing my condition in a straightforward manner. His explanation was direct, without unnecessary detail, but enough for me to understand the severity of what had happened. I listened quietly, processing each word slowly. Recovery would take time, and my condition required ongoing attention. As he continued explaining, he began to reveal the full extent of my injuries. And what he said next made the reality of my situation even more serious than I had initially understood. As he continued speaking, the full extent of my condition became clearer. His tone remained calm and professional, but the information he shared carried weight that was difficult to absorb all at once. My body had sustained multiple injuries from the fall, and several parts of it had been significantly affected. My body was severely damaged. He explained that I had multiple fractures, including injuries to my legs and ribs. Some areas required stabilization, and my movement needed to be restricted to prevent further complications. The impact of the fall had caused widespread damage, which meant that recovery would not be immediate or simple. Every part of my body needed time to heal properly. Listening to this, I tried to process what it meant for me moving forward. Simple actions that I once took for granted would now require time, patience, and assistance. Even basic movement would need to be gradual and controlled. My condition required careful monitoring to ensure that healing progressed without setbacks. He also mentioned that recovery would depend on several factors, including rest, proper care, and consistency in following instructions. The healing process would not happen overnight. It would take time and steady effort. As I listened, I remained quiet, taking in each detail. The reality of my situation settled in slowly. I understood that while I had survived the fall, my body had undergone significant trauma, and returning to normal would require a long and challenging process. Despite the seriousness of the situation, there was also a sense of direction. I was no longer in immediate danger, and there was a plan for recovery. That alone provided a small sense of stability in an otherwise uncertain moment. And with that understanding, marking the start of a new phase in my journey, one that would test my strength in ways I hadn't experienced before. The recovery phase began slowly, one day at a time. The initial focus was on basic stability, resting, maintaining proper support for my injuries, and gradually allowing my body to begin the healing process under supervision. Every step hurt.
Even the simplest actions felt challenging. Sitting up, shifting positions, or attempting to stand required assistance. My muscles had weakened, and my injuries made movement both difficult and painful. There was no rush in the process. Everything had to be done gradually to avoid setbacks or additional strain. I became dependent on the people taking care of me. They helped with basic needs, guided my movements, and ensured that I followed the necessary precautions. Their support was consistent and practical. They didn't overwhelm me with questions or pressure. They focused on helping me recover in a steady and controlled manner. Each day followed a similar pattern. Small improvements would occur, but they were slow and sometimes barely noticeable. There were moments when I could move slightly better than before, and other moments when the pain felt just as strong as it had at the beginning. Progress existed, but it required patience. During this period, I had time to reflect quietly. Without distractions, my thoughts often returned to the events that led me here. The memory of the fall, the silence before it, and the realization of what had happened began to replay in my mind more frequently. At first, I tried to focus only on physical recovery, but the mental aspect of everything started to become more present over time. Even though my physical condition was the primary concern, I couldn't ignore the internal thoughts that began to surface. The experience had not only affected my body, but also left an impact on my mind. And as my body slowly began to heal, deeper emotional trauma started to surface, bringing with it memories and realizations I had not fully processed, yet as my physical condition slowly improved. I began to notice another challenge that didn't involve my body. My mind had started to process the events in a deeper way, and with that came memories that I couldn't easily control. During moments of rest, especially at night, my thoughts would drift back to the fall. I couldn't forget his face. That image stayed with me more than anything else. The moment before I lost balance, the way he looked at me, and the absence of emotion in his expression replayed in my mind repeatedly. It wasn't just a memory, it felt vivid, almost as if it was happening again each time I closed my eyes. Nightmares became a frequent occurrence. In those dreams, I would find myself standing at the edge again, reliving the same moment over and over. The feeling of falling, the sudden loss of control, and the impact would return in a cycle that felt difficult to escape. Each time I woke up from these dreams, my body would react instinctively, my breathing uneven and my heart racing. These experiences weren't limited to the night. During the day, certain triggers would bring back brief flashes of the fall. A sudden movement, a shift in balance, or even a quiet moment of stillness could remind me of that experience. These flashbacks were short but intense, making me pause until they passed. I began to realize that while my body was recovering, my mind was still trying to understand and process what had happened. The emotional impact of the betrayal, combined with the traumatic nature of the fall, had left a deeper effect than I initially expected. It wasn't something that could be resolved quickly or ignored. Despite the support around me, I often found myself alone with these thoughts. I didn't always share what I was feeling, as it was difficult to put into words. Instead, I carried these experiences internally while continuing the recovery process. During this time, I made a conscious decision not to contact my family immediately, choosing instead to wait until I felt more stable and prepared to face what came next. After everything I had been through, the idea of immediately returning home didn't feel right. Physically, I was still in recovery, but mentally, I wasn't ready to face the life I had left behind. Too many questions remained unanswered, and too many emotions were still unsettled. I needed time before going back. I knew that returning too soon would not only be difficult for me, but could also overwhelm the people I cared about. I needed clarity, stability, and a stronger sense of control over my own thoughts before stepping back into my previous life. At that point, my focus remained on healing both physically and mentally without rushing into decisions that I wasn't prepared for. During this period, I spent time reflecting on everything that had happened. I replayed events in my mind, not to dwell on them, but to understand them better. I wanted to be in a state where I could think clearly, communicate effectively, and respond to whatever awaited me without breaking down emotionally. The environment I was in provided the space I needed. There was no pressure to make immediate decisions, no urgency to act, and no external expectations pulling me in different directions. That allowed me to take things one step at a time and focus on regaining strength at my own pace. I also began preparing myself mentally for what returning home would mean. I didn't know how people would react or what changes had taken place in my absence. There was uncertainty around many aspects of my life, and I understood that facing them would require both emotional readiness and inner stability. Rather than rushing into the unknown, I chose patience. I allowed myself the time to recover properly and rebuild my confidence before taking the next step. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt necessary. And as the days turned into weeks, time continued to pass quietly, bringing me closer to the moment when I would eventually have to return and confront everything I had left behind. As time passed, the steady progress of my recovery became more noticeable. My body, which had once been severely limited in movement, slowly began to regain strength. The pain was still present at times, but it had reduced enough for me to handle basic mobility with more confidence than before. Each small improvement felt significant, as it marked a step forward from the condition I had been in after the fall. Was ready to return. Alongside the physical healing, my mental state had also begun to stabilize. The constant emotional turbulence that had followed the incident gradually became more manageable. The nightmares became less frequent, and the flashbacks, while still present, no longer dominated my thoughts in the same way. I had reached a point where I could think more clearly about my situation without being overwhelmed by fear or confusion. During this period, I spent time organizing my thoughts and preparing myself for what returning home would involve. I understood that the situation I left behind had not remained the same. Time had passed, and with it, changes were likely to have occurred that I would need to face directly. I focused on building enough emotional strength to handle whatever awaited me. Also became more certain about the importance of confronting reality rather than avoiding it. Staying away any longer would not resolve the unanswered questions I carried. At some point, I needed to return and understand what had happened in my absence. Even if the answers were difficult to accept by the end of this period, I felt a sense of readiness that I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't complete certainty, but it was enough to move forward. I had regained a level of control over both my body and my thoughts, and that gave me the confidence to take the next step. And with that decision made, the journey back home finally began, leading me toward a reality I had been away from for 3 months, and one that I knew would not remain unchanged. When I finally reached my home, everything appeared unchanged at first glance. The streets were the same, the surroundings familiar, and the exterior of the house looked exactly as I remembered it. For a brief moment, it almost felt like nothing had happened. Like I had simply returned from a long trip rather than something far more complicated, but something felt off. Immediately, as I stood outside, I noticed a subtle difference in the atmosphere. It wasn't something I could clearly define, but it was enough to make me pause before stepping forward. The feeling wasn't based on a visible change, but rather an internal awareness that something didn't align with what I expected. Took a moment to observe the house more closely. Lights were on inside, and there seemed to be activity happening within. That in itself wasn't unusual, but the combination of the familiar setting and the unfamiliar feeling created a sense of hesitation. I wasn't sure what I would encounter once I stepped inside. My heart began to beat slightly faster as I approached the entrance. Each step forward carried a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. I had spent the past 3 months away, preparing myself mentally for this moment, yet now that I was here, the reality of it felt different than what I had imagined. I tried to steady myself by focusing on my breathing. This was the place I had called home, the place where my life had once been stable and predictable. But now, standing outside it, I couldn't ignore the sense that things had changed in ways I hadn't yet seen. I reached the door and paused briefly. For a moment, I considered the possibilities of what might be waiting inside. There was no way to know without stepping in, and that uncertainty made the moment feel heavier. After a short pause, I gathered my thoughts and prepared myself to face whatever was on the other side. And then, with a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped inside, not knowing that what awaited me would immediately confirm that nothing was the same anymore. As I stepped inside, the first thing that hit me was the noise, voices, music, and movement all at once. The house was filled with people. Lights were on, decorations were visible, and the atmosphere resembled a gathering, something organized and intentional. For a brief second, I stood still, trying to process why this many people were present. My world collapsed again. Then my eyes adjusted, and everything became clear in a way I wasn't prepared for. In the center of the room stood my husband. He was dressed in formal attire, standing confidently among the guests, smiling as if he belonged exactly where he was. There was no sign of hesitation in his expression, no indication that anything unusual was happening. He looked completely at ease, surrounded by people who seemed to be celebrating something important. My breathing slowed for a moment as I tried to understand the situation. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing at first. It felt disconnected from reality, like something that shouldn't be possible. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became, and then I saw her dot my sister. She was standing beside him, dressed as a bride, her appearance matching the setting around her. She was smiling, interacting with the guests, and carrying herself as though she was the center of attention. The way she stood next to him, the way they appeared together, it left no room for confusion. The realization hit me all at once. This wasn't just a gathering. It was a wedding. My legs felt weak beneath me as I processed the situation. The same man I had married was now standing here, marrying my sister in the same home I once shared with them. The emotions inside me became overwhelming shock, disbelief, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal all at once. I took a step forward, then another, unable to remain still. My heart was racing and my hands were trembling slightly as I tried to make sense of what I was witnessing. Around me, guests continued to move and talk, unaware of the internal storm that had just begun within me. I wanted to speak, to question, to stop everything, but the words didn't come out immediately. The weight of the moment made it difficult to react right away. As I stood there, trying to gather myself. The reality of the situation fully settled in. Everything I had known had changed, and before I could take another step forward, someone suddenly grabbed my arm. I turned, and it was my mother, her expression urgent, pulling me aside as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. My mother didn't say anything at first. She pulled me away from the crowd, guiding me toward a quieter corner of the house where the noise of the celebration faded into the background. Her grip on my arm was tight, not forceful, but urgent, like she had been holding something back for a long time and could no longer keep it inside. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were filled with emotion, relief, fear, and something deeper that I couldn't immediately identify. "Alina, you're alive," she whispered, her voice shaking. I held on to her, trying to steady myself. "Mom, what is this?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What's going on here?" She hesitated for a moment, then took a breath, and then she began to speak. The truth changed everything. She explained that what I was seeing was not something that had happened suddenly. It was planned. Carefully, deliberately, and over time. According to her, the people I trusted most had been involved in a coordinated plan that I had never been aware of. She told me that my husband was never who I believed him to be. His behavior, his distance, and even the relationship itself had been part of something deeper. My sister, who stood beside him as a bride, was not just a participant in the wedding. I was hearing that she had been involved from the beginning. My mind struggled to keep up with what I was hearing. Each sentence added a new layer to a reality I had never imagined. My mother continued, explaining that others in the family had also been part of it. The plan, as she described it, was to build trust, gain access to wealth, and ultimately remove me from the picture in a way that would appear accidental. She paused briefly, watching my reaction, then she reached for her phone. "I have proof," she said. She showed me recordings, audio evidence that had been gathered over time. Voices I recognized, speaking casually, discussing plans, timelines, and outcomes as if they were handling something routine. My husband's voice, my sister's voice, others, each one confirming what my mother had just told me. I stood there in silence, trying to process the reality of it all. The conversations, the tone, the lack of hesitation in their words, it all pointed to a level of intent that was difficult to accept. As the audio continued, my chest tightened. The betrayal I had already felt was now being confirmed in the most direct way possible. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate. My mother then explained that she had been collecting this information quietly, waiting for the right moment to act. She had suspected something was wrong after I disappeared, and over time, Her suspicions led her to uncover evidence that pointed toward a coordinated effort before I could respond. She looked at me with determination. "This ends today," she said. We both stepped back toward the main hall. The noise of the celebration filled the space again as we approached. Guests were still gathered, unaware of what was about to unfold. My husband stood at the center, speaking to others, while my sister remained beside him. My mother stepped forward. "Everyone, please stop," she said firmly. The music cut off. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned toward us. Silence filled the room. Then she held up her phone and connected the audio to a speaker. A voice played. My husband's voice. The room reacted immediately. People began to look around, confused at first, then increasingly shocked as the recordings continued. Each voice added more clarity to what was being revealed. Conversations about plans, about outcomes, about intentions that had never been meant to be public. Whispers spread through the crowd. Faces changed from curiosity to disbelief to shock. The atmosphere shifted completely. My husband's expression changed. For the first time, he looked unsettled. My sister stepped back slightly, her confidence fading as the evidence played out in front of everyone. "No, this is fake," my husband said quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. But his voice lacked conviction. The reaction around him told a different story. My mother didn't argue. She simply let the recordings speak for themselves. Within moments, the situation escalated. The presence of the recordings, combined with the visible reactions of those involved, created enough clarity for others in the room to understand that something serious was unfolding. Then, sirens were heard outside. Police entered the house shortly after. They moved in with purpose, already informed and prepared. The situation was assessed quickly, and the individuals involved were identified. My husband, my sister, and others connected to the plan were taken into custody one by one. There was no chaos, no resistance that changed the outcome, only the final confirmation that the truth had been exposed. I stood there as everything unfolded, watching silently. The same people who had once been part of my life were now being led away. Under the weight of their actions, the truth had come out completely. The truth changed. Everything, not just the situation in the room, but everything I believed about the people closest to me. What I had experienced was not random. It had a cause, a structure, and consequences. As the room settled and the police finished their process, I remained standing, processing everything that had just taken place. In the aftermath, justice had been served, and despite everything I had endured, I was still here, alive, aware, and mentally stronger than before. No longer the person who had once trusted blindly, but someone who now understood the depth of truth, survival, and resilience.